Just to let you know about the Alliance, so the Washington Health Alliance has been around since 2004. We are a member-driven organization, purchaser-led, but we also have health plans, providers, and other affiliates within that. We collect data. We use that data to drive quality improvement, look at health economics. We bring people together with the purpose of creating value and then driving the market in terms of being able to move the market to improve quality, affordability, and most recently, how do we impact the equity of care provided within our state. And we do that in a few different ways. We think everyone ought to have a primary care doc. We think primary care is really important. We think pharmacy transparency is really important. We think behavioral health is important from an access standpoint, but also from an outcome standpoint. We think referrals to the best provider is the best way to go. You get better quality and lower costs. And we also think that anything we do needs to build on a resilient healthcare system. We can't, gut the system by, try to shortchange it one way or the other. So having fair pricing and equitable, reasonable pricing, I think, is important to us. And then one more slide ahead. We just got a couple of things coming up. We got a webinar next week. We got a big symposium like this on June 6th related to hospital pricing. We just put out a report last week. Go to our website and take a look at it. It shows all the hospital reports as a % of Medicare. That is based on the claims data. And so the data is the data, kind of what we're going to be talking about today. Next slide, I just want to introduce Antonio Chacha. So Antonio began his career early as a pharmacy technician. I'm going to see if I can do this from memory. As a pharmacy technician for about 3 years. And then he was going at sort of that pharmacy track when he was at the Ohio State University, and then for some reason decided communications and political science was a better avenue for him. And so he went that way. And as you hear him talk, you go, oh yeah, that's why he did that. So he was part of the Ohio Pharmacy Association, helped them find almost $250 million in savings on their Medicaid plan. And since that time, he's really been able to run a couple of different organizations. 48 Brooklyn, 46 Brooklyn, I don't know, something about Brooklyn. And then where he is today, 3 Access Advisors. And what they did is they took the data from the Washington State Pharmacy Association that they collected from data suppliers, retail pharmacists, et cetera, interrogated that data, and that's what he's going to share today about what it is, what it isn't, how to understand it a little bit more, and how to start asking the right questions as you go back to your usual place and understand this is what it means, and am I getting the best value out of what I intend to have for my population? So with that, I'm going to introduce Antonio, and I'm going to get off, and we'll go from there.
All right. I am excited to be with you today. First, I want to thank Jenny Arnold, the team of the Washington State Pharmacy Association, for being sponsors of the report and helping to corral one end of the spectrum of a drug pricing transaction. Conversely, I also want to thank Jenny and Washington Health Alliance for helping to corral the other end of the transaction, which is what people are putting into the overall pharmacy claim itself. I have the great fortune of knowing Denise Giambalvo with Washington Health Alliance. I knew her when she was over at the Midwest Business Group on Health. And I consider her a great friend because, as Drew mentioned, I started off as a pharmacy guy. Pharmacy is the end result when the money goes in, right? And pharmacists, in my experience, have not been happy with the way that the marketplace treats them. Whether they're paid fairly or not, big picture, from a pharmacy perspective, the returns have been, in many instances, diminishing. To Drew's point, when I started in this business, it was pharmacists complaining about underpayments in the Ohio Medicaid program. I went back to Ohio Medicaid at the time and asked, did I miss something? Why are pharmacists complaining about these massive underpayments, to the point that we lost about 200 to 300 pharmacies over a 3-year period, mostly in underserved communities that had a disproportionate share of Medicaid? Well, when I asked the state of Ohio what changed, they said nothing. We're paying more for drugs than we ever have. So how is that possible? How could the pharmacists that are filling the claims say we're getting less, while the state of Ohio, which is dumping taxpayer money into that system, is saying we're paying more? Well, we found a growing gap in between those experiences. And so since then, we have worked to help diagnose and eliminate inefficiencies and inappropriate incentives in the prescription drug supply chain, understanding that drug pricing is a black box that every member of the drug supply chain is responsible for creating, right? But we as payers, we as patients who want medicines, pharmacies, et cetera, everybody represents an opportunity to shed light into what's happening inside that black box. So next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of what we did, Washington State Pharmacy Association asked us to conduct what is a first-of-its-kind study, getting granular data from pharmacies, granular data from employers, and simply asking what's happening on both ends, and might there even be instances where there's overlap. So we got 6 million claims from pharmacies across the state of Washington, and 3 million claims from employers across the state of Washington. The idea here is to say, if everybody's dissatisfied with what's happening in a drug transaction, let's at least start seeing what's happening on either end. Next slide. So let's talk about the system as it exists today. For those of you that are students of the game, you should know Drug Channels Institute. If you don't know Drug Channels, I highly recommend that you subscribe and follow to the great work of Adam Fine. Next slide. This is his map of our labyrinth of a prescription drug supply chain. And I will asterisk this by saying this is a simplified version, okay? So there's a lot of stakeholders and a lot of transactions that occur between point A and point B. And every transaction has a sub-transaction, meaning that there's a sticker price, and then there's a reconciled or net price after that. Well, as you might imagine, the buyers and sellers at every stage of this transaction are not interested in you understanding what's happening both at the top and the bottom. They don't want you to know the prices they're charging in general, and they don't want you to generally know what the negotiated amount is either. And so penetrating this black box becomes incredibly difficult, which is why access to data is everything. Next slide. So this is the boring stuff, okay? In case I start using acronyms and not giving proper context, I'm going to give you some of it on the front end. Wholesale acquisition cost, WAC. WAC is the list price that drug manufacturers make available to drug wholesalers. So drug companies sell drugs to wholesalers who then sell them to pharmacies. So the WAC is what drug makers make available to wholesalers. By definition, this is federally defined. It does not include discounts, rebates, or other reductions when published. So, said differently, there are allowable retrospective price concessions that will reduce the net WAC price that is ultimately paid by the wholesaler. Then you have AWP, average wholesale price. In pharmacy, we used to jokingly call it ain't what's paid. I now refer to it as always what's profitable. AWP is a bogus inflated sticker price that has no actual representation or correlation with the underlying cost of a medicine, okay? Except with brand drugs, because AWP used to be so bad that there was litigation that actually required that those who publish AWP as a result of a big settlement, to require that AWP have a fixed relationship to WAC. But for AWP on generic drugs, it is a figment of our imagination, all right? The same drug made by two different manufacturers, okay, interchangeable, could have the same underlying cost within a few cents of each other, but the AWP could be hundreds of times difference between one supplier versus another. Why does this matter? For those of you that sign contracts with large PBMs, almost all of them that we see in the marketplace are tethered to discounts off of this bogus, inflated AWP benchmark. Next slide. MAC, maximum allowable cost. MAC is a term of art that PBMs have created to essentially create a price for like interchangeable drugs. So think of it this way. Let's say there are 15 different manufacturers of a particular generic drug. If you've hired a PBM, understandably, you want to make sure that you're getting a competitive price. So if there's 15 different suppliers of a drug, you don't want to pay based upon whatever the pharmacy bought. What you would like to do is try to pay based upon the going rate for that product. So MAC pricing in concept is to say there's all these different prices. We're going to pay based upon what is prevailing in the market. You know, essentially a sober, reasonable acquisition cost. That is what MAC is supposed to be on paper. In reality, MAC becomes the keys to the car to invent prices. PBMs can use MAC rates to set them artificially low based upon what the real cost of that product is. They can also set them artificially high. So when you have a pricing term that allows for subjectivity, bad things and good things can happen. Then there is national average drug acquisition cost. When we helped diagnose the spread pricing calamity in the state of Ohio, one of the benchmarks that we used was this national average drug acquisition cost. It is conducted federally by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. What they do is they ask every pharmacy, or they ask 2,500 pharmacies every month. They say, what did you pay to put the drugs on the shelf? With that survey, about 400 to 600 pharmacies respond, and with that, CMS creates a data file that says this is the going rate for pharmacies to acquire drugs. Now, it isn't perfect, but it creates a directional representation of what a sober cost for a drug can be. Next slide. So I realize that that probably warranted another cup of coffee. So let's talk about the actual study. So this is a look at the pharmacy reimbursement experience. So of the 6 million claims that we got from pharmacies, this is a breakdown of how cost was essentially created. This is called a Sankey chart. I hate this chart, be clear. Like, this is the most confusing chart that you'll see. But on the left side of this chart, what you have are, the blue bar is where big three PBMs are, okay? So as you can see, from a pharmacy perspective, about 80% of all payments are coming from the big three PBMs. I actually was told that there were some members of the big three and their trade association, the Pharmaceutical Care Management Association here. They represent the large PBMs. And I thought it was so cool that you are here today at Seattle Unity Church to come find Jesus and learn how this stuff actually works. So amongst the pharmacy data, what you can see is the orange bar represents Medicaid. The red bar represents Medicare, and the light blue represents commercial, okay? So from a pharmacy perspective, you could basically see Medicaid claims represent 24% of their experience, 43% Medicare, 33% commercial. On the right side of this, you see the yellow and the purple. The yellow represents what you employers paid for those claims. Purple represents what members are ultimately contributing, so 10%. Next slide. This is the view from the employer's perspective. So on the employer side, you have the blue bar represents the big three, the red represents other PBMs, and the light blue on the right side is, again, payer contribution relative to green member contribution. So you have over half the claims are big three PBMs. In general, sometimes smaller PBMs will white label the pharmacy network rates. So the big three impact of this data set could actually be more significant than over half. But more importantly, that right side shows about 94% of the expenditures of plan sponsors are coming from plan sponsors, 6% are the patient. Next slide. All right, so this is a breakdown of the differing experiences, okay? So over the 4-year study, we saw plan sponsor gross costs increase 30%. So the itemized receipt that employers get say that your costs as a starting point before rebates, et cetera, went up 30% over that time frame. Pharmacies aren't getting the manufacturer rebates. So the study is, rebates are very important, but understand that pharmacy rebates are not being passed through to pharmacies. So we're running comparisons of gross costs on both ends. It is a very applicable apples to apples comparison. Because if the cost of the drugs that employers are paying for is growing 30% over time, well then one would reason that pharmacy reimbursement for those drugs would also be increasing 30% over that same time period. It's not even close to directionally happening. What you see is over this 4-year time frame, the overall pharmacy reimbursement based upon 30-day equivalents is actually decreasing 3% over the time frame. So again, this is independent experiences, one going up 30%, the other one going down 3%. Next slide. So the question is, okay, is 30% reasonable? Is it not? Well, we try to run a comparison based upon other benchmarks for growth over time. We looked at the Washington plan sponsor data, which is the green bar here. As you can see, 7%, about 14.6%, 7.8% year over year. We compared it to the consumer price inflation index, right? So inflation over that same time period, 7%, 6.5%, 3.4%. So the gross costs incurred by employers is increasing at a faster rate than actual overall inflation numbers to an arguably significant degree. When you compare to the RX line item of how they compute CPIU, employer costs are also eclipsing that. And lastly, if you compare it to year-over-year changes on brand name drugs, the list prices, they're basically holding steady at 4.8%, 4.9%, 5% over time. So the employer costs are growing at more rapid paces than other benchmarks that might give you insights into what might be happening in the marketplace. That's bad, okay? You're outpacing other metrics of growth in the market. Next slide. So in unpacking the employer claims, all right, looking at the health plans, 89% of the claims were for generic drugs, 11% were for brand. On the pharmacy side, 10% were brand and 90% were for generic. So we're overall, in terms of the buckets, brand versus generic, we're essentially looking at very similar buckets. So let's look at the brand drugs, okay? So this is the gross expenditures for brand drugs for employers, the green line, or sorry, next slide. So you see the gross costs for employers on brand name drugs increased 55% over 4 years. $548.38 per 30-day equivalent. That's huge, right? If you're an employer, you're sitting there saying, I have a brand drug pricing problem, I'm sure, right? Well, look what's happening on the pharmacy end for brand drugs. Pharmacies are getting $1.78 less per claim, despite the overall employer costs going up $548. It's actually a decrease in reimbursement from the pharmacy perspective. Next slide. If you're sitting there saying, yeah, but you know, rebates might make that a little bit different, you're right, right? But with generic drugs, not really any rebates there. So the question then is, what's happening there? Well, plan sponsor saw a $3.92 increase per generic drug transaction, a 17% increase, while pharmacy saw a 4% decrease over the same time period. As I said, what you're seeing are these diverging experiences based upon their exposure to the PBM creating either a price that's charged or a price that's paid. Next slide. So before we start making this out to be somewhat problematic, I think an important thing to understand is that drug companies and pharmacies are both setting sticker prices that are not set in what I would call a sober way. Pharmacies and drug companies are in the position of negotiating with PBMs, okay? So drug companies, when they set a price, it will represent the best case scenario of what they will ever yield on that product. Pharmacies, the same thing. So when I studied pharmacy claims back in my time in Ohio, one of the things I always asked of pharmacies is, okay, you say you're getting less and less over time, but when I look at these screenshots that you're sending me, it looks like you're charging like $500 for a drug that might be $50. Why is that? Is it because the pharmacy is rotten and villainous? Same question I would pose to a manufacturer. You know, if you're setting a price of insulin for $400, right, you're only making $35, why would you do that, right? Well, the truth is that we all get differentiated experiences based upon that net negotiation that the PBM is doing on behalf of that plan sponsor. So I'll show you this in a minute, but understand that when a manufacturer or a pharmacy is setting a list price for a drug, that's aspirational, right? Sometimes they'll get all of that. Very rarely they'll get all of that. Sometimes they'll get a fraction of it. Sometimes when you look at Medicaid programs or 340B programs, all right, the manufacturer is getting the absolute least amount. On the pharmacy end, if they are getting a payment from a big three PBM that has tremendous size and scale, they'll get significantly less than what essentially they would aspire to charge. But from this perspective of the bogus inflated prices that pharmacies set on their prices, the PBM is giving a 70% savings. So if you're a PBM, you're sitting here saying, this is the end of the presentation, right? Because we've had 70% savings relative to what pharmacies are charging. But again, context is necessary. Next slide. So how are they achieving these savings, right? What is savings ultimately look like? These are complicated charts here, but they are probably the most important in conveying what it is I'm saying. So this is a margin distribution chart. At the front end of this presentation, I explained to you the benchmark National Average Drug Acquisition Cost, or NADAC. It is a surveyed price the federal government creates that ultimately represents the directional underlying costs that pharmacies pay to put a drug on the shelf. What this does is it says, based off of that benchmark, what are pharmacies being paid versus what are employers being charged? Make sense? So if I have 6 million claims worth of data from pharmacies, this boils them down into essentially percentiles, as if they occur in only 100 claims. Same thing on the employer side. So the left side over here is the experience of the employer. You may not be able to see this way in the back, right? But there is a $0 line. $0 essentially means break even. Well, as you can see on the left side, there's some red bars that are moving below zero. Those represent times when the employer is being charged less than the underlying cost of the drug. So the first one off to the left is essentially the best case scenario from the employer. They're getting a huge discount relative to the cost of the drug. Then the next claim hits, and it's a slightly less discount, but it's, again, under cost. And what you can see is that the plan sponsor's experience is now below zero. Now, all of a sudden, things start moving upwards. Those represent claims where the plan sponsor is being charged above the cost of the drug. What you can see here is that they're getting a good deal on some claims, But as you start moving further and further right, what you can see is big charges relative to the underlying cost of the drug. Well, the right chart is pharmacy's experience. It's far more exacerbated. What you see is that while on the plan sponsor side, they're barely getting below zero, and eventually they get to the point where they're being charged over $1,000 beyond the cost of a medicine. Well, on the pharmacy experience, they're getting to the point where they're below $100, and they only work their way up to get just over $600. So one of the reasons I say pharmacy prices are bogus is because when PBMs contract with those pharmacies, one of those provisions in that contract says, we'll never pay you more than what you bill us. And that usual and customary price that the pharmacy sets has to be the same for everybody. So there are most favored nation clauses in those contracts that say, you can't bill anybody less than what you bill us. So when a pharmacy is being underpaid on a lot of what they do, and then being wildly overpaid for a fraction of what they do, if they were ever if they ever wanted to lower their prices, they would be chopping off the thing that is making them sustainable. So PBMs are not responsible for the prices necessarily that are being set by pharmacies, but they are indirectly very responsible for the incentives that cause pharmacies to set bogus inflated sticker prices. Next slide. So to give you an idea of the comparison experience, the first 11% of claims in the employer data shows that they're getting a discount relative to NADAC, the underlying cost of the drug, whereas pharmacies are being paid below cost on 18% of those claims. The plan sponsor, the first claim is worth about $23 below cost. The pharmacy is receiving $33 below cost. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, those overpriced claims, looking at the 99th percentile, the most marked up drugs, the plan sponsor is being charged $172 above cost, while the best case scenario for the pharmacy is $120. Now, overall, even though these are not direct matched claims, this is just looking at the independent experiences and the differences between. The plan sponsor data suggests that they're getting charged about $10.30 above the underlying cost of the drug, whereas pharmacies on average are receiving $6.40 above that cost. Next slide. So all this is very general so far, okay? Now we're going to actually start getting more granular, and we're going to get increasingly more granular as we go. This is looking at the margin over the acquisition cost of the drug for the payer experience and the brand. As you can see, we might have what we call a drug mix issue. One of the things that might be driving the brand costs over time to be so significant relative to what pharmacies were experiencing is the fact that they're dealing with more expensive drugs. So the payer is paying more and more for the underlying cost of the drug over time relative to the pharmacies that are getting not the same degree of growth. In saying this overly simplistic, what it means is that the employer might be paying for more and more expensive drugs, but the pharmacies aren't dispensing more and more of those expensive drugs. Next slide. This is the same look from a generic perspective. As you can see, the underlying cost of the drug for the employer is going down, although the overall charges are not going down as rapidly as the underlying cost of the products. Meanwhile, pharmacies are doing better from a margin perspective over time on generic drugs, but the overall value of those claims is in a state of decline. Next slide. So the question then is, which drugs have the highest markups, right? What is driving this divergent experience? Well, these are the top 10 highest markup drugs over the underlying cost of the product. So of the top 10 most upcharged drugs from the employer's perspective, okay, we simply asked the question, did the pharmacies in our study get to dispense any of them? What we found was that out of the top 10 most overcharged drugs to an employer, the pharmacies in our data set only got to dispense 3 of them. Now, what that means is that for some reason, retail pharmacies are not getting as great of exposure to the most overpriced claims that employers are paying for. Next slide. Well, let's look at the top 20 high markup drugs. Pharmacies got to dispense 5 of those ones. So 20 drugs that were the most overcharged to an employer. The retail pharmacies got to dispense 5 of those. When they did, the pharmacy's reimbursement was significantly lower than what employers were being charged for those drugs. So the average pharmacy reimbursement is the second column here. As you can see, the pharmacy got $313 on this one drug at the top. But that was $89 less than what the plan sponsors were charged for that drug. You have the next drug, where pharmacies received $22.95 above their cost for the drug. Employers were charged $167.91 above that. So when pharmacies are getting access to the most overpriced medicines, for some reason, they're getting paid a lot less than what employers are being charged. Next slide. The thing that I find the most interesting about examining pharmacy benefits data is not just when I see big markups or big markdowns. I am fascinated by inconsistency. One of the studies that we did back in the fall was called Unraveling the Drug Pricing Blame Game. When you get through this little beast of a 106-page report, if you're a real sicko, okay, you can go on our website and read that one. We found a drug where the same pharmacy on the same day was reimbursed by the same PBM 5 different prices. And it wasn't just like a penny difference. The low end was the pharmacy receiving about $9 and change, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, it was $96. A 10x multiplier difference where the same drug on the same day at the same provider, the price created by the same PBM, very wild different experience. Well, we decided to ask the same question within this data. Can we find instances where the same provider on the same day, on the same drug, are getting very different experiences? Well, as you can see, we had 2 PBMs that created 5 different prices for amtricitabine tenofovir. Ryan, what the heck is that brand? Generic Truvada, thank you. I should have known that, actually. The low-end price set by PBM A was $30. The high-end price was $420. Same day, same PBM, same provider. The other PBM in our data set charged $10, with the prices going all the way up to $1,313. With brand Truvada, we saw big differentials as well. $1,720 payment to the pharmacy all the way up to $1,846. Next slide. What about the plan sponsors, right? Pharmacies might be getting paid different rates. Are PBMs charging wildly different rates to the employers? Well, they are. We found several instances where the same day, the same PBM, the same pharmacy organization, all right, the plan sponsor was billed wildly different rates. So the epinephrine auto-injector, lowest price, $274. A different pharmacy location within the same organization, $407. Omeprazole, 40 milligrams. Chain location 1 got $5.30. Chain location 2, $6.20. Chain location 3, $70.99. How is that possible unless there is something other than a straightforward approach to how we're pricing medicines? Next slide. So our big thing that we did in Ohio was busting up spread pricing. Spread pricing is when a PBM pays a pharmacy one rate, bills a different rate, pockets the difference. $245 million later in Ohio, they fired the PBMs, sued one of them. One of them settled for over $1.4 billion. and the state moved to a transparent model where they had one vendor, set pricing, no subjectivity, et cetera. So we wanted to ask, is that possible to see spread pricing in this commercial data? Next slide. We did not have unique claim identifiers in this study, okay, for obviously patient privacy reasons. But the beauty of this data, because we had so much of it, so thank you to those who did participate in this, I could see instances where the same drug was dispensed at one pharmacy, all right, and see that in their data, where on the other end of the spectrum, I have a plan sponsor who bought that same drug at that pharmacy on that same day. And if there were no other claims that were paid for at that pharmacy, I have what I will call a very likely match, right? Next slide. So there's limitations with this, be clear. But I will tell you, based upon years of experience, these claims are most likely the exact same claims that were experienced on both ends of the transaction. So what we did is we just said, let's look at those claims. So I mentioned we had 6 million pharmacy claims, 3 million plan sponsor claims. Of the plan sponsor claims, we found 20,000 claims that are what we would call likely matches. It's less than 1%, so like, let's not go crazy, all right, but let's just show you what we see when first of its kind see both ends of a transaction, right? Of the matches made, we found 35% of those claims where the health plan was charged more than what the pharmacy was paid. 17% where the opposite happened. Pharmacies were paid more than what the plan sponsor was charged. Interesting, right? 48% passed through, meaning same prices on both ends. Next slide. So looking at the overcharges relative to what pharmacies were paid, on average, brand drugs had markups that were $25 higher than what pharmacies were paid per claim. On generic drugs, these spreads were $27 per claim. So that means pharmacy on average received $32.49 on a generic claim. Plan sponsors were charged almost double. So those lower costs on generic claims means generic spreads resulted in PBMs charging roughly 80% more than what pharmacies were being paid. Next slide. Here's an example of how ridiculous I think spread pricing can be. This is generic Suboxone, a vital drug for the treatment of addiction. The plan sponsors were charged $195.73 for this drug. The underlying cost of the drug was around $96. Pharmacies were paid $18.77 below that. So the pharmacy incurs a loss of $18.77. The plan sponsor is charged over $100 beyond what the pharmacy is paid. So if you're sitting there, your employer, you might be looking at this drug saying, hey, I don't want to pay for more of this stuff, right? Well, of course, your markups are really high. But on the pharmacy end, you're sitting there saying, I really hope that patient doesn't come in today. What an asymmetry of incentives for a drug that most people need to actually stay alive. Next slide. This is a list of the top spread markups, okay? This is a confusing chart when you see it later. On the left side, what we show is what the plan sponsor is charged on average per claim, what the pharmacy was paid on average per claim, and what the delta is. Now, I mentioned that some drugs result in the opposite, where plan sponsors are charged less than what pharmacies are paid. The right-hand side of this, we're showing you the net impact. Because sometimes the drugs that are being the most marked up are also the drugs that are being the most marked down. Next slide. Now let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum, where plan sponsors are getting a deal relative to what pharmacies are being paid. As you can see on brand drugs, you can see instances where the plan sponsor is being charged $39 less than what pharmacies are paid, and on generics, about $12 in difference. So the question then is, what is the net impact? Well, here's the next slide, please. Here's the examples of, again, same type of chart, except looking at the opposite end of the spectrum. Next slide. So what is happening in the aggregate? Because the claims where the plan sponsor was being upcharged relative to the pharmacy provider's reimbursement outnumbers the opposite from happening 2 to 1, and because brand drugs are roughly only 10% of utilization, we found employers being consistently charged more than what pharmacies were being paid. The plan sponsor saved approximately $35,000 on the claims where their costs were lower than pharmacy reimbursement. However, those savings were not sufficiently offset as their costs were $200,000 higher when costs exceeded pharmacy reimbursement. The impact on 20,000 claims was over $8 in gap per transaction. To give you a sense of sizing, the Ohio Medicaid program, when they fired and sued their PBMs, right, the average spread per claim was just over $6. This is over 8. Next slide. So one of the questions we wanted to ask beyond spread pricing is, if there's a divergent experience where small chain and independent pharmacies who participate in our study are getting one experience, but plan sponsors are seeing something different, might a possible explanation be that small chain and independent pharmacies are unique relative to other pharmacy classes of trade? So in examining the plan sponsor data, small chain and independent pharmacy only make up 13% of their claims. Grocers represent 37% or 27%, chain drugstores 38%. Now, on the other side, you have 2% of claims that are mail order. So the rest of this analysis is going to be examining what is the different experience for mail order pharmacy, which is comprised of PBM-owned mail order and specialty pharmacies. What is the experience of chain pharmacies? What is the experience of grocery pharmacies? And what is the experience of small chain and independent? Next slide. I have to be totally honest with you. When I saw this data, I said, this is incorrect. Rerun it. And when I saw it again, I said, rerun it. Retail pharmacies in aggregate are positioned significantly worse in the marketplace relative to PBM-affiliated mail-order pharmacies. So for 97% of the claims in our plan sponsor data, that's every drug that plan sponsors paid for that had a NADAC data point. Remember, NADAC is a transparent directional idea of what the underlying cost of a drug is. So 97% of all the plan sponsor claims had a NADAC data point. So this chart examines all 97%. And what this shows is that relative to the cost of the drug, on brand drugs, independent pharmacies are getting paid on average $1.34 above their cost. Mail order and specialty pharmacy, the average margin per claim is $47.06. The chain pharmacies had a best case scenario on the brand side, on the retail side, $14 over cost. Mail order pharmacy is having markups that are over 3 times that of chain pharmacies. But it doesn't stop there. The generic side, independent represented the best case scenario in retail. They were getting paid $14.45 above the underlying cost of products. Specialty and mail order pharmacy, the markups were $47.70 a claim. Next slide. So while mail order pharmacy represented just 2% of the overall claim volume that employers were paying for, what we found was that they captured 18.5% of the 1% of most profitable claims. So let me restate that. That old chart that I showed you where we had the distribution curve, right, where it was going up over time, that last part of the chart was the most profitable claims, or the biggest markup claims within the pharmacy data. Despite mail order only doing 2% of claims, they got 18.5% of those. So if there was no thumb on the scale, right, you would think that the most profitable claims, mail order would get 2% because they represent 2% of overall claim volume. Well, no, they found a way to get significantly more exposure to the most overpriced claims. Small chain and independent pharmacies represent 13% of the overall prescription fills for the most profitable. They did better too. They got 19%. but mail order was far outpacing the benefit, if you will, of high profit claims. Next slide. So this is looking at the chain pharmacies now. So same chart. Chain pharmacies got 38% of total prescription fills, but they only got 38% of the most profitable claims. So they're essentially 1-to-1. Next slide. So this is a look at the median, or I'm sorry, the mean cost above the drug, both the top 1% and the bottom 1%. What you can see here is that mail order pharmacy, the value of the top 1% that they got was significantly higher than every other pharmacy class of trade. So the top 1% for independents was $479 a claim. Chain pharmacies actually did the worst. The top 1%, the value of the top 1% from their experience, $325. Mail order, the top 1% was equivalent to $586 a claim. So to put this in very simplistic terms, mail order got a disproportionate share of the most profitable claims. And when they did, the charges were significantly higher than any other class of trade in pharmacy. Now, mail order, on the other end, got a lot of underpaid claims as well. And they had a high exposure to those. Independents got the worst exposure to underpaid claims. Chain pharmacies got the least. Next slide. So, okay, I showed you, that was all the data looking at drugs that had a NADAC price point. What about drugs that don't? As I said, the plan sponsors, of the claims that they paid for, 97% had a NADAC that we allowed a comparison to. So the question then is, if NADAC is transparent and publicly available, what might we see on the drugs that don't have a transparent price, right? Would those prices be better or worse? Remember, NADAC is a reflection of pharmacy acquisition costs. This means that if the drug isn't typically dispensed in the retail channel, it will not have data inputs for CMS's benchmark. So to investigate the drug costs for these non-NADAC drugs, we turn to WAC, the list price of the drug, and the Texas Medicaid retail prices, which I'm not going to explain, but Texas has a published file that tells us the going rate for some of these drugs. Next slide. The problems we identified are exacerbated significantly when looked at through this view. The median price relative to the cost of the drug, and you'll see this in the report, the averages will show this directionally as well, are being, the plan sponsor is being charged on brand drugs $243 above cost, all right, relative to grocery pharmacies, which are being paid $8.15 below cost on these products. On the generic side, right, you have grocery pharmacy getting paid $34 and change below cost, worst case scenario. Mail order pharmacy is receiving over $1,300 a claim. Next slide. So what we see is that the retail class of trade on these non-NADAC drugs are being significantly underpaid relative to the prices and markups that are being charged through PBM-affiliated pharmacies. Next slide. We did another sub-analysis of these, quote, non-NADAC drugs, because the list price isn't the real price, right? We all know that. So we said, might there be a transparent benchmark out there that we could run a comparison to? Thank you, Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban, rather than setting inconsistent prices, right, that charges one person a different price, somebody else a different price, right, constantly changing what they are, Mark Cuban has one price, and he publishes it online. You can go on his website at any time and download the file. So what we asked is, for all the drugs where Mark Cuban has a price point available, let's run a comparison to what employers are being charged. The beauty of this analysis in terms of its comparison of Mark Cuban cost plus drugs to what PBM mail order pharmacies are charging employers is that they're both mail order pharmacies, right? So one would assume that the Fortune 50 companies that we've entrusted, who have huge size and scale to get the best discounts in the marketplace, surely they would be beating the heck out of Mark Cuban, who just rolled out of bed a few years ago and decided to start a pharmacy company. Well, when it comes to these Mark Cuban cost plus drug comparisons, as you can see, he's significantly cheaper than everybody, right? No question about that. But as a comparison point, what you can see, mail order pharmacies yielded margins relative to Mark Cuban that were 586% higher than the reimbursements that were received by chain pharmacies. Meanwhile, Washington plan sponsors were charged 2,291% more for these non-NADAC drugs than what could have been achieved at the same time through Mark Cuban's cost plus drugs. I'm going to put in a little editorial. It's ridiculous, okay? There's absolutely no excuse for that degree of disparity. Next slide. So here's the true story about what's happening in mail order and specialty pharmacy. This is the same chart that we had earlier, except it's broken out by class of trade. So you have chain pharmacy in green, grocery pharmacy in blue, small independent pharmacy in a light blue, and then mail in a dark blue. What you can see is that the underpayments and overpayments that we saw within the pharmacy data bear out. But mail order is screwing up my chart, okay? You can't really see the differences between those classes of trade because mail order is somehow so unbelievably special and different. What you can see here is that over time, looking at most drugs, mail order is giving a great deal relative to what retail pharmacy charges are. But once you get to around the 80 or the 90th percentile, that deal goes away. And in the aggregate, mail order becomes significantly more expensive on everything relative to what is happening in the retail class of trade. The last 5% of claims, a lot of times when I do these studies, PCMA and the PBMs will say, well, this is cherry picking, right? You're looking at these outlier examples, and in the aggregate, it's different. Well, these are cherries because they're planting cherry trees, okay? They make money off a lot of money off a very small segment of what they do. 5% of claims are responsible for 73% of all the plan sponsor markups that were charged to the employers. Next slide. You didn't think I was going to hit 10 o'clock. So the report is over 106, it's over 100 pages, okay? It'll be released within the next week. If you care about drug pricing, you care about the costs that you're incurring, you have to read it. The thing that I am annoyed by, more so than anything, is how undeservedly opaque and complex this transaction has become. I love pharmacists, right? They provide a very valuable service. But when it comes to the dispensing of one drug for another, in general, the costs don't need to be that different, okay? You have a known product, a known quantity of that product, in a pill bottle with a service offered by a healthcare professional that in general we have a good idea of what it costs to do it. These underpayments and overpayments and undercharges and overcharges aren't worth the trouble. The rebate schemes that we didn't even get to talk about here aren't worth the trouble. If you zoom out and look at everything we buy in healthcare, this is the easiest thing we can buy. And we have allowed it to become so complex that it takes over 6 months just to get enough data from a sliver of the marketplace to teach people how it works. It's undeserved. Plan sponsors, you're in the driver's seat of changing that, right? I'm not telling you who to contract with or who not to contract with. The approach that we have taken en masse is taking us in the wrong direction. And the thing that I'm most concerned about based upon these findings is that we're finding the most uncompetitive prices are occurring at the companies who have been hired to give you the most competitive experience. These companies who are driving these pricing decisions are the same companies who are now the biggest employers of physicians across the country. So the playbook that is being run in pharmacy is coming to a medical benefit near you. This system doesn't deserve the trust that it's gotten. And in fact, I would argue we need to distrust and verify many times rather than letting the price setters to also be the price takers. So as we see your costs as employers ballooning and exceeding other benchmarks for growth in other marketplaces, right? What we know is that PBMs are determining the fates of both plan sponsors and the pharmacies. And we're seeing hidden cost drivers emerge that demonstrate inflated prices on a subset of medicines. Within those subsets, mail order and specialty pharmacies are receiving a disproportionate share of the benefit of highly marked up medicines, while traditional retail pharmacies are saddled with a disproportionately high exposure to underpaid claims. The data in this study suggests that significant savings could be achieved through the retail pharmacy channel where conflicts of interest in price setting are minimized. And with that, it was 10:01. Sorry.
All right. So first and foremost, I want to thank everybody for inviting me to talk. This is a passionate story of mine, and I really appreciate the opportunity to address such a fine group. I really appreciate the panel as well. That was great discussion. I thought it was fantastic. Again, hearing all those opportunities and things that you can do inside in order to eliminate a lot of that waste inside of our pharmacy program. So what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about Mosaic Life Care, which is the health system that I am part of, and kind of our venture towards this idea that we have to manage our pharmacy spend. So we consider ourselves a life care company because we're a hospital system, and I will kind of go into all that. And we do use a platform from Vintegra, and I'm going to explain how that works for us and why we chose that. But it's a fun story, and it's I hope you're a little bit entertained, and I hope we get some good information. So again, thank you for inviting me. So let's see if I can get the slide to advance. All right, so a little bit about myself. I am currently working, I've worked for 25 years at Mosaic Health Systems out of St. Joseph, Missouri. Most of you have never heard of us. We're about an hour north of Kansas City, right smack in the center of the country. We're not terribly far from the true dead center part of the country. We're a small system. We have 4 hospitals. We have a main hospital. We have a couple of, we have a critical access hospital and a dish hospital, as well as an LTAC. So I've been board certified in internal medicine for 25 years, and I actually continue to see patients as well as run our pharmacy program for our system. And I am Mayo Clinic trained. That's what I call home prior to coming down here 25 years ago, but I've been here for quite a while now. So that's kind of who I am. And let's talk a little bit about St. Joseph. So what you would know about St. Joseph is you would remember the Pony Express. And the Pony Express is probably what we're most famous for. This was the origination point for the Pony Express back in 1860. And for 18 months, riders would take the mail and they would hop on a horse and they would ride across the country in short 2 to 3 mile sprints on their horse. And back in 1860, for $10 or so, you could get a piece of mail across the country in as little as 10 days, the equivalent of $10. And so the amazing thing about that is it lasted 18 months. And then it was the telegraph line came along and put the Pony Express out of business, which is why, but everybody knows about the Pony Express, and St. Joseph is where the line originally started. I think the coolest thing about that is that the reality is in 2024, it still takes 10 days to get a letter from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Maybe a little less money, but it's still about the same amount of time. So with our current service. So that's kind of what St. Joseph would be famous for. We were your very prototypical healthcare. We had a couple of ancient old hospitals that had been conflicting and, kind of warring back and forth. And in 1984, since we're a blue collar community, we don't have a lot of wealth. It became difficult for 2 systems to survive, and we merged into what we call now Mosaic Life Care. And so we became a single hospital system inside of the city of St. Joseph. We then acquired a critical access hospital in a neighboring community, and ultimately a dish hospital as well. And what this did for us is it put a catchment area of about 250,000 lives inside of our population. We don't have a lot of competition in the area because we're an underserved area. Again, we're not a very wealthy area. A lot of agriculture and commercial or farming, manufacturing, which of course took a big hit. So we've been cost conscious since 1984 when these two hospitals merged to form the one system. The big thing is that, again, this was out of importance or need, because we had to form a more disciplined organization than to have multiple systems. And so we've been at this for a long time with regards to being fiscally responsible. So how does that get into the drugs? Well, we've all seen something like this. We know that, we spent $348 billion on prescription drugs in 2020, 3 times more than what we spent back in 2000. We know that this is going up tremendously. We can see the graph on the other side. The projected increase is tremendous. One of the questions was about specialty medications, and I agree. The only thing that's special about them is the price of them, right? They restrict the access, and then you get a huge price increase. So there's specialty drugs are on the rise, and this is really kicking things up. I remember back in 2003 or so, we had a drug rep come in and that to our office, and that was the first time that something had crossed $50 a month as an internist. And in a cost-conscious community where we had to really watch those dollars, we couldn't believe that something was more than $50 a month. If we had something that was $50 a month now, we wouldn't even think about PAing or talking about ways to mitigate that. We'd say, $50 a month, go for it. Problem is, things aren't $50 a month anymore. They can be up in the worlds of millions of dollars now, and not as an exclusive single cost agent. So we all know this, we all feel this. Every business in Washington understands this implicitly, and that's why you're here. So this is just a factual slide. So what does that have to do about us and our story? So I want to tell you kind of how we got going and what our story was and what happened. So I'm on the board of trustees for our healthcare. We have 4,000 employees. We have 8,200 lives that we cover inside of our communities as a health system. So these are our employees, and we're self-insured. So I happen to be on the board of trustees. Okay, sounds great. So in 2017 or 16, 17, I looked at our plan spend. We're going over our numbers, and our plan spend is going up like crazy with regards to pharmacy. And then I asked the stupid question, why in the world is that going up so much? And they said, that's a great idea for you to go figure that out. So I start looking into this thing. And that's, of course, if you ask a dumb question, sometimes you get assigned work. And that was my problem. So during 2017, we were hitting at times PM of about $120 per member per month for our employees back in 2016, 17. So I started looking into this. Well, what drove this? I immediately, the panelists were discussing the fact you have to pay attention. You have to look at where your spend is going. You have to get down. One of the panelists described himself as a drug nerd, and that I applaud, because again, I'm that nerd, and I'm a nerd who actually uses the drugs and prescribes them too. So I'm very, very sensitive to medication costs, because my community is not exactly a wealthy community. So that year we spent $110,000 on Vimovo. What the heck's Vimovo? Well, Vimovo is esomeprazole, Nexium, and naproxen put together, 2 over-the-counter products put together. And we spent $110,000 that year on Vimovo. Well, for $110,000, I'll get you a semi-load of both of those, right? So when you look at the 2 ingredients cost, it was $7 for the naproxen and about $18 for the esomeprazole. The going rate was $2,500. And so that's what triggered my whole story about going, okay, we have to start to look at this stuff. We have to delve into what's going on. Well, this was a game that was being played in order to, again, by the PBMs. They loved Vimovo because they're getting a huge rebate on the backside of this. So the PBMs they're not PA and Vimovo. So of course I go, well, who's our PBM? All right. So again, you start asking questions, you get assigned work, at least in my institution. So I find out that our PBM is Optum. So I, of course, called up to Optum and I said, hey, I want to block Vimovo. And they said, yeah, you can't do that. And I said, well, of course I can do that. And they said, nope, can't do that. And I'm like, well, that's a bunch of crap. Of course I'm going to do that. So I fortunately happened to be going to RFP. And so at this point in time, I really started to educate myself about PBMs versus a PBA. And a PBA is that, pharmacy benefits administrator versus a manager. And these are subtle differences, but they are important. And the PBA, I wanted a transparent PBA that I knew what I was going to pay, just what the panelists were talking about. I mean, I needed to know where my rebates were. I needed to know where they were going, how much was my medicine actually costing me. So I went to RFP and I got my consultant, my broker. I was a novice. I acknowledge that. So I got a broker, and of course, the broker, we had 3 finalists come in, and they said, okay, here's what, you need to go with PTI. Great. PTI is out of Omaha. It's a PBA. It's a transparent PBA. It's just north of me, about 2 hours out to get some pretty good service. And I said, great. Now, at that point in time, the Bob Takatoma, who was also in that RFP for Ventegra, said, I understand PTI might sell out. And I'm like, well, my consultant says this is what I should do. Well, the lesson I learned in there was, as was said by the panelists, don't trust your consultants. You need to verify, you need to trust your gut. You need to make sure that you understand why your consultant is recommending who they're recommending and what are their aligned incentives. Are they pure or are they impure? Well, so I hired on with PTI. And we were able to cut our PMPM down substantially with PTI. However, in the course of about 8 months with the PTI, so I had to issue all new cards to all my 8,000 lives. I had to give out cards and say, okay, here's your new pharmacy benefits administrator, PTI. Great. 8 months into this or so, PTI decides to sell to Diplomat. All right, fine. So I issue 8,000 more cards for Diplomat. And about 2 or 3 months into that, Diplomat decides to sell to Catamaran. Great. So I issue another 8,000 cards to all my employees saying, here's your new PBA. And of course, as you can imagine, I'm endearing myself to both the board of trustees as well as all my employees at this point in time. 2 or 3 months after that, Catamaran decides to sell to Optum, and I am right back where I started. Now, fortunately, I had the ability to renegotiate and get out of that right away. So, of course, I did. I went to RFP, and I ultimately settled on another transparent PBM, aka Ventegra. The key aspect to that for me was the fact that Ventegra is, we know the cost of the medicine, we know the cost of the administration, we know exactly what I'm going to pay, and all rebates and everything were transparent and passed through. So it allowed me to understand what the true cost of my program was. And I think that is a critical, the panel alluded to this. This is a critical aspect, is we have to make sure that we're looking at the right goalposts. And they had some great suggestions for you regarding all the opportunities that are out there. And this needs to be, all these things need to be brought together to get control of a pharmaceutical spend, because the pressures are extreme in trying to make the spend go up, because again, they get rebates and kickbacks on the backside. So transparency is a huge plus. So I ultimately went back to Ventegra, and here are these are my actual outcomes and what we've been able to do. And so what you'll notice is, again, we were spending about $11.5 million back in 2016-17. And ultimately, I have been able to get that flattened down on our PMPMs. And I run somewhere between $65 and $70 PMPM now. That's with my 340B money in there. So we happen to be a 340B hospital. If I were to take out my 340B savings, I would be running a PMPM at this point in time of about $35, which is the result of a lot of different efforts, but part of which is that transparency, part of which is understanding what the pricing is, part of it is the PA. Your panelists kind of told you the secret sauce. Putting it all together, though, into a business is what's the difficult part, but we've been able to do that and pretty much hold our costs down and keep our plan. So currently I'm running, again, this year I'm running right at about $70 PMPM, which the industry average for healthcare is $140. And if you look at all books of business, including, because, healthcare tends to use a little bit more than, manufacturing or other service industries. So the PMP or the PMPM total for pharmacy spend would be about $130 for most industries. For healthcare, it's 140 to 145 is what you're going to be looking at. So we're running about 65 to 70. And we've been able to maintain this now for years, despite inflationary pressures and cost of medication pressures, by implementing strategies to help control our spend. So I think the important part about this graph is the fact that this can be done. I think the other thing that's really important, especially from my standpoint, is I had somebody point this out to me. I gave this presentation at a conference, and somebody came up to me and said, that's really impressive, because if I were to have a person be a donor, an angel donor to our hospital, to save my program over the course of the last 6 or 7 years, we've saved about $40 million. That is more than 1 year's operating revenue for us as far as our capital expenditures go. So I've saved us about $40 million by keeping our drug spend down. If I were to do that, so over the course of 7 years, I would need about a $5.5 million, run per year is what I've saved on this on average. Well, I would need a $100 million donor. I don't have any $100 million donors to the hospital in my community. So if I had a $100 million endowment fund that I could invest, I would be able to get about $5 to $7 million back on revenues to invest in the hospital. So in effect, what controlling my pharmacy spend did was it was like having a $100 million donor come to the hospital and donate for a wealth fund. And again, I don't have that opportunity inside of my community. So this has been tremendous for our community as far as being able to use our resources in other ways to make sure that, we have a state-of-the-art PET scanner, we have a state-of-the-art accelerator for radiation therapy, things that in a rural community you would not normally see. We've been able to do because we've been able to cut that waste out that the panel was talking about of about $40 million, which again, we spend between 30 and $40 million on a whole year's worth of capital, just to put that in perspective for us. So over the course of 6 or 7 years, we've gotten 1 extra year of capital that allowed us to do a lot more in our community, keep our wages competitive and health high, get our benefits where we want. These have all really, we've been able to plow that money back into to our system rather than into a PBA. So that's the outcomes of what we've done. Now, what can you do to do this? Well, the big thing is we have to look at, these are just some suggestions, control your formulary and, line by line auditing yourself as to what are you doing with your formulary, what medicines, where are they going, who's prescribing them. And this takes effort. And it takes an unbiased, or appropriately aligned eye to do this. Because again, if you have the wrong alignment, you can easily pass those things through. So control your formulary, adjust your plan for your market. We've been able to adjust this according to what our needs are with regards to hiring. So I'm cognizant of this when I adjust our plan at all times as to what do we need in our market? What do you want us to do? Are you in a competitive market for employees? I have one place that I work with. They said, look, we're not worried about the cost of medicine. We consider that to be our competitive advantage to getting good employees. Great, we can do that. But for most of us, that's not the case. We don't live in those high margin industries. We participate in the PA process. Anything over $1,000 a month has to come through me. We have a very strict PA criteria. We use Vintegra's base and their bones, but we have a PA group, and I have 3 other physicians that help me with this on the side. I do the first line. My 3 other physicians, if the appeal goes past me, they come in and they'll help me with the appeals. So we set a threshold arbitrarily at $1,000 a month. We PA everything to make sure that we're getting the right drug to the right person at the right time, at the right place with the right cost. Again, one of the panelists said it great. She said that you have to make sure that it's not saying no necessarily. It's about saying yes to the right drug at the right place, the right person at the right cost. And sometimes it is no. And sometimes there's a lot of waste in our system. So we do that. What about, we enhance multiple tools to help our savings. We do all sorts of different things that we're constantly focusing on. How can we save a few bucks here or a few bucks there? The biggest thing is to start to look at your total cost. And again, your panel alluded to this. The simple fact is that when we go to talk about these things, they always come up with all these things that they want you to look at. But what it really comes down to is, what is your true total cost? Get to the bottom line. What is it that you truly paid for? Cost minus minus the rebates. What did you really, really pay for? And you have to understand that, or it's an impossibility to control something that you don't know whether the data is correct or not. I'm a fan of transitioning from a PBM to a PSA. I think with transparency is a big deal. The administrators, you can find transparent PBAs out there. They're much better for you. You can find a whole lot of opportunity inside of that. And then I think you got to start looking into the future, and you have to spot trends. And I put on there Dupixent. I did a presentation nationally on something that I call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And I will tell you, Dupixent is one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for us as employers in healthcare. So we have to understand, we got to look ahead, and we got to say, what drugs are coming down the line? Which ones are going to be high dollar? How are we going to think about these before people are, we have a ton of people on them? Because once you have a ton of people on them, it's really tough to talk about scaling that back down. So look to the future and go, what else can I do before I have to? And that's been one of our real secrets to success. We didn't get burned by the GLPs and the things like that. We've been very cognizant. We want to use GLPs. They are awesome drugs. They do exactly what we want them to. They help people tremendously, but we want to make sure the right people are getting them for the right reasons. And we put that in place long before the GLP fad really hit. And so again, those are the type of things when I say look to the future and try to spot the trends that are coming. So it really takes nothing to join the crowd. It just takes a lot to stand alone. You have to consider being different, getting away from the broker, getting away from, the idea that, or you have to find somebody who's got the aligned incentives with you as your broker. It's not that you can't use a broker, but you have to make sure that their incentives line. My first broker, his incentives were not aligned with mine. They were aligned with PTI. I'm sure of it. I can't prove that, but I can tell you that's what I think happened. So one of the things, again, we have to be careful about, we have to know what we're metricing. So what's the common thing that we use to decide now? Well, we talk about AWP discount guarantees, and we say, the bigger your guarantee, your discount, the better. But that has a faulty assumption, because we don't know that you're getting the best AWP. So, I'm giving you 20% off of a way higher price. That's probably that's a poor judgment criteria in my mind. But these are the things that everybody tried to force on me when I first started doing this. They were like, you got to look at the AWP, minus your discount, right? Okay. Then you got to look at your, dispensing fee guarantees, right? So we're gonna promise you, this will be your dispensing fees, but the judging criteria would be the lower the better. We got rebate guarantees, man. We all want rebates, right? The bigger the better. The administration fee guarantees, the lower the better. These are all the criteria we use to judge these things. Now, the problem is when I roll all that mess together, what are you really worried about? You're really worried about your total cost, right? That's the deal. So we got to make sure we're looking at the thing, because I use this analogy because, again, we can look at 1,000 different surrogate markers and come up with the wrong answer. So this was a 2002 Texas, the Texans versus the Steelers game. First downs, Steelers 24-3. You got rushing yards, 128-37. You got total yards, 422-47. By every surrogate marker, Pittsburgh won that game. However, the real score, so they won 1-1. They won every surrogate marker you can possibly get. AWP, administrative fees, dispensing fee guarantees. They won every single surrogate marker, but they lost the game. Because the final score is really what you pay. And that's to me, the key aspect was getting past all this other stuff. I don't care what my rebate is, because what I paid minus my rebate, my total cost minus my rebate is what I truly pay right here. That's all I care about. And so when I designed my plan, the whole goal was to get down to the final score. What is that final cost? And that doesn't mean I don't, it's great when I get a little bit of a rebate or whatever, but that is definitely not how I make a judgment about what plan or what PBA or, how I'm going to manage my plan. Rebates are irrelevant. It really comes down to, are you looking at the right final score? So this makes no sense, but it's what happened in that game. We want to make the final score. We want to win. That goes down in a win category. It doesn't go down under all the surrogate markers. So I'm going to encourage you to look at this. And here is our trend. Again, when you look across from 2018-19, we have been able to hold our PMPMs since we've been with Vintegra. And it's through partly what they do, but it's also partly what we do. And we design a system that has been, but it's all about total cost, because I want to know what my true final cost is. And we've been able to hold our PMPMs down despite, over the last 5 years now, despite the fact that we've had high pressure inflation, lots of expensive medications added to it, through some of the various different programs that Vintegra offers, as well as the fact that we look ahead and we try to figure out what the incoming trends are. So with that, that's kind of Mosaic's story. We've had a great run at this. This is not a hopeless environment. You have the possibility to control this depending upon how much disruption you want to take. And the reality is we can still deliver very valuable care. In fact, I would contend we can probably deliver more valuable care through this methodology than just opening the doors wide open, because we tend to get, one of the presenters quoted a 40% waste, and I don't think that's an unreasonable number. There is a lot of waste that occurs inside of here if the doors are wide open. I hate the idea of having to do all the restrictions, but we have to make sure that people are cognizant. So with that, I'm open for any questions.
Yep. Okay, can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
I think there's just a delay. I've got a question for you.
Go for it.
I'm a big proponent in evidence-based formulary first. Then let's talk about the pricing. Then let's talk about what you're bidding on, right? I mean, that's what you're bidding on. You're putting that first. How does an employer know that they have the right formulary in place? What's right for the patient?
That's a great question. And I think that health systems have an advantage here. Again, I'm a practicing internist. I still see patients 3 days a week. I run, I use these medicines. I'm very in touch with the, evidence-based aspect. And I agree 100%. I mean, the goal is not to give you a low-cost, crummy drug. The goal is the outcome of the health. But the reality is there's still a lot of waste in there. So if you do not have expertise in this area, you need to hire the expertise in this area to get this done. Health systems oftentimes have those expertise to at least start to carve that formulary down to what has evidence-based. But I think it's a great point. This is, people sometimes look at me as the no man, but it's not about saying no. It's about saying yes to the right drug, right cost, right place, right patient, right time.
Yes, a question, if you can hear me. This is Renzo with US Arcs Care. You mentioned the word disruption at the end, and I wanted to ask you, I think there's the perception that with change or with savings must come disruption, blood in the streets and a line outside the door at HR. Could you comment on your experience?
Yeah, so actually, I review my formulary every 3 months. I usually change on the order of about 6 to 7 medicines per year now that I've got my formulary where I want it. We always take into account how many people are going to be affected by that change and what is the disruption. There is always disruption to some degree, but I can tell you that there's been no blood in the streets. There's no lineups at HR. We don't have mutiny. Everybody is very concerned about that disruption. The reality is most of your savings are going to occur on drugs that affect very few people, because those are the high dollar specialty medications, and making sure that you're administering those at the right time, right place, right cost. So again, that disruption, I could craft a formulary that would be $30 PMPM. Will that be disruptive? You betcha. Absolutely. I could tighten mine down to $30, even with my 340B. I could make that thing I mean, I could make it sing, right? But it's going to be disruptive to people. So that's that balancing your environment and your institution of what you're doing versus the cost. And again, pick out a number. If you do this correct, if you have the formula correct, you can just choose your number and say, look, we don't think we can do better. You know, if you got me below 90 PM, you're going to probably disrupt my ability to hire, et cetera, et cetera. Great. I can tell you exactly what you got to do to get a 90 PM. I mean, it's not that hard once you understand all the moving pieces. So we have, we've been able to tolerate in our environment, despite all the nursing shortages, et cetera, and as a hospital, that's a big deal. But we've been able to get it down to $65 to $70 and have very good patient satisfaction or, employee satisfaction with that, where we don't have a ton of disruption. It's a great question.
And I'll say that I was at a coalition in Arkansas where we got it down to the same PM, no disruption.
But you got to do it. When I change people's medicine, I send out a letter. Here's the change. Here's why, and then I have my pharmacist call. We discuss alternatives, we mitigate that disruption. If we just did it behind their back and didn't tell them anything, I think there might be a little more blood in the street, but I've never had any blood in the street because again, we handle it extremely well.
Yes, I will add that we did letters to the members and to their primary care to the prescribing doc.
Yep.
On opportunities for savings, recommending a switch in drugs within a therapeutic class. Okay, Dr. Kammerers, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. If you ever want to hear about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, let me know, because I think I know what the 4 horsemen are on the future for us. So I'd love to give that presentation too at some point in time, because again, I think there's challenges are coming and things are not getting cheaper. We know the specialty pipeline is huge, and we're going to have to answer these questions sooner or later. So the moral story is, again, be prepared for the future.
Love to have you back to talk about that. And maybe we can get your compadre, Dr. Shannon, to join you.
That would be awesome. I'd enjoy Shannon. Thank you, everybody.
So now I'd like to invite Chris Pierce up from Costco. Chris is responsible for their pharmacy benefits for their employees and business strategy. And,
All right, so hopefully you guys can hear me here. How's that? Good? Lots of friendly faces in the audience. Good to see you guys. Thanks for the opportunity to present. Thought we'd tell a little bit about the Costco story here today. Next slide, please. We've been on the journey that you heard many of the panelists and previous speakers represent, and we found a few solutions along the way. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about where we've been and where we've been successful in some of those, and then provide you a testimonial or two as to how this works. So I'm a pharmacist by trade, as Denise shared. I run our health program here that we call Costco Health Solutions. Next slide. Been with the company about 20 years, working on the initiative, so a number of scars and wounds to carry with some of our successes. So you may know Costco as a place, hopefully you guys find something interesting to buy as a retail shopper, and hopefully we've found something to be memorable in your trip back home. Fairly substantial enterprise now, over $200 billion in annual sales, representing over 875 warehouses in terms of the forward-looking elements. A lot of infrastructure exists behind the scenes to make all of that magic happen. So our distribution system, our coffee roastery, our commissary system, our chicken plants, right? And along with that is our pharmacy operations. So routinely recognized as a low-cost leader in providing value to employers and members across the country. We operate about 550, 570 U.S. pharmacies We operate 2 specialty pharmacies, 3 mail-order facilities, 5 central fill facilities, a pretty substantial set of infrastructure behind the scenes in order to manage that operational cost and provide value to our organization. As you might expect, with an enterprise as large as it is domestically, we have a pretty significant employee population of our own. So we have about 350,000 beneficiaries of the plan, which, as you might imagine, creates a fairly significant expense for us and an area of active management. Very similar to Dr. Kammerer's presentation on how they look at expenses, we too have that same perspective. Next slide. So some of our learnings, again, echoing what some of the other presenters have said, as we look at the healthcare spending broadly, I would say there's 4 key tenets to achieve the better quality, the better outcomes, and the more efficient use of your hard-earned margin or additional income. So first and foremost, again, repeated multiple times today, misaligned incentives, a lack of transparency, the wasteful spending, and a subpar member experience. So that combination is what motivated us to look at how we can do something different. The next slide. So today we provide a number of different programs in the marketplace. On behalf of our own employees, we spend over $1 billion a year in healthcare, over $300 million in just pharmacy expenditures alone. And it's an area for which we take great pride in being able to recruit talent for our warehouses and our infrastructure, but also in our ability to hold a leadership position in the communities for which we do business. We like being recognized as a good place to work, and our benefit package is core to making that happen. So in the darkest blue up there, the commercial coverage, we went and sourced a solution on behalf of our own employees that does the same things you heard the folks talk about today, right? No spread pricing, fully transparent, 100% pass-through. We save our own plan north of $100 million a year. It's an enormous number, and it allows us to take those dollars and repurpose them into other goods, programs, and services that we make available to our employee population. So contraceptive consultations, rotating vaccination clinics, a whole collection of non-pharmacy related services that are made available through those savings. So it's a very important vessel to get right, and we make that available for not just our own offering, our own population now. We actually make that available for about 1,000 self-insured employers around the country of various shapes and sizes, all of which who look to Costco as being someone they can partner with around the creation of the formulary, a trusted fellow employer for making intelligent decisions about drugs and which medications their members should take. We have a unique visibility into the system because when we operate as many pharmacies as we do, we have very good visibility into the buy side. So like Antonio referenced, it's important that you can see those costs to be able to then pull them through to the end of the chain and understand what something should cost and what you should pay for it. So those are important elements for us. You know, we dispense somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 million prescriptions a year, $6-7 billion in total sales. So it's substantial there for us with good visibility. Over the years, we've added a couple of other enhancements. The next one is that direct-to-member program. So quite a few folks who carry a Costco card in their wallet. There's a growing collection of medications that aren't covered, or individuals who are between coverage, or individuals who just have crappy coverage. And we said, well, could we borrow some of the learnings from a better formulary, a lower cost, a trusted partner for distribution, and bring them value? And so we create a network in that capacity using our direct-to-member savings, partnering with the manufacturers to push the rebates through at the point of sale for the member. And so those individuals can shop as you might imagine, at a Costco pharmacy if they choose to do so. But we wrap that with 20,000 other pharmacies, including independent pharmacies and some chain pharmacies and some other destinations. We think that's a novel platform. We have about 30 different manufacturers that participate in that process and offer rebates, which we then act as the financier for those rebates, pushing them out directly to the member in the form of a lower price. So just like you buy something else at Costco, if it's on coupon or in the MVM and you say, oh, this is $5 off, we facilitate that in the pharmaceutical space as well. And lastly, our newest addition is the direct to employer program. So as we've gone and talked to other organizations, or like many of you might find here, there's entanglements with current PBM contracts. And so you're at the beginning of the contract, you're at the end of the contract, you're in the middle, you got the consultant, you're asking good questions, but you're working on it. It just takes a lot of time. And so when we asked ourselves what could be done differently, we said, well, could we take the best of what we do on behalf of this large employee population and this collection of other self-insured employers, as well as our direct-to-member experience, where we have millions of members transacting in that program on a daily basis, and say, what could we do that would bring the best of those out into the marketplace as efficiently as possible? And so this is our newest initiative. We call it the direct-to-member program. We facilitate it with a zero copay for the member, so there's an automatic incentive for anybody who wants to use this, and we collaborate with major employers around the country who run this program in parallel with their existing PBM. So no change to your existing relationship. We just plug into Costco Health Solutions for whatever program you want to offer. And so I'll go through one of the areas that we've been prototyping with a couple of large coalitions. But as you can imagine, this is a chassis that allows us to bolt on lots of different options in different capacities. So as you're doing the diligence around finding those areas of wasteful spending or frustrating transactions, we have some business solutions to you if you want to help in the space. Go to the next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about Humira. I think some of this was said earlier, at least around the significance of the item. So this again, just one example here, but Humira, for those of you who don't know, it's a specialty, for repeating the word that's used today. Medication in the injectable, routinely used or initially used for rheumatoid arthritis, came to the market in 2002. Very successful product, arguably the most successful pharmaceutical in U.S. history. In 2021, over 1 million prescriptions had been dispensed for this product. A number of indications have been expanded since the initial onset, and a very substantial price point for this product. So if we move to the next slide. So for us, it was important to look at the trajectory. When we look at an engagement with an employee, it's not just what they're doing for us in the first year or the second year. We retain our employees for a significant amount of time, some of the longest in retail. And as a result, when we look at pharmaceuticals, we see those trends being important. So I think the report had a 4 or 5% compounded trend in it. When we look at some of these specialty products, we see an even larger accelerated trend. So what's interesting here, or noteworthy, is you have a product with a trend line of a 7 or 8% increase on a $6,000 price point, 2018. Today, that price point is close to $8,300. So that's a substantial expense for us. If you're looking at your data, you likely have a significant number of transactions for this particular product. If we go to the next slide. This was our most costly product in our specialty expenditures, and a number of alternatives have come into the market. Some of you have read some of those reports, but the adoption has been very, very slow, right? And so we ask ourselves, well, why is the adoption slow? And the adoption is slow for all the reasons that the other panelists have described. There's an inherent bias to maintain the status quo because it's more cost-effective for those traditional players. There's an income stream, the consultant, there's a whole process. And so managing our own benefit, we said we want those dollars repurposed in another capacity. We heard pushback as we pressed on this issue around concerns that the prescribing community wouldn't endorse what will ultimately be a generic specialty version of this medication. And so myself and the clinical colleagues on my team, we dug deeply into that to make sure that we were in a strong position, right? We didn't want the revolt from our own employee population. This is a significant event for us. It was also important for us as a testimonial to say we're gonna eat the food that comes out of our own kitchen, right? And if we can't do it for ourselves, we can't ask anybody else to do this. And so we moved 100% of our patient population, next slide please, onto 2 biosimilars, right? And we're gonna save another $20 million this year with just this one drug move. And so, it's important for the audience to take away from this. There are options for you. There's dollars available for you, and you can use these dollars in any way, shape, or form. If you want to subsidize your community pharmacies, if you want to start a collaboration around employee adherence or retention, all of these options are available to you, and we're here to help. For us, what we found interesting is we moved to a product, to 2 different products, but most notably a product from a company called Celltrion, a product called Euflyma. It's a great biosimilar. They supported us in the transition process. They supported us with the patient education. And these are some of the testimonials that we got from the individual members, that they actually liked the product more significantly than they had previously used the brand. To give you some sense of the context, we talked about an $8,300 price point. If you assume you get a 15 or 20% off, kind of an AWP discount, that gets you close to the $7,000 number. If you've got a standard contract with your PBM for a rebate, call it $1,500, all right, that gets us close to $5,500 on a net price number. We make this product available through that third pie in the direct to employers for $1,000 a month, right? So, saving you an annualized cost for each and every patient north of $60,000 a year. So you have the autonomy to make choices in your benefit. Again, we can help you understand where we think your fishing is going to be most fruitful, but I'm telling you, there's substantial dollars that are available here for you. And so, lastly here, this is kind of how that direct-to-employer engagement is framed, should you choose to want to use it. Today, the coalition members who are using this, we have a 0 copay for the member, so no out-of-pocket. Again, no PBM change required. We provide the reporting back to you for the number of transactions and how this works. We've got the clinical team available for assistance with ongoing refills. This is done through our specialty pharmacy, so it's shipped directly to the member. It actually includes a Costco membership. We think that's a nice appealing differentiator, and again, available to all self-insured employees. So, trying to summarize a couple of decades worth of work here in 10 or 15 minutes, and empower you with some motivation and help you understand there are resources available for you. So, with that, I'll step off the podium.
Thank you, Chris. Questions? Questions for Chris? Yeah. Mark? Let me bring the mic to you. Well, we've got people online.
Do the big 3 PBMs and their affiliated consultants welcome your program?
Yeah, we've yet to find one who's excited to welcome the program. It does create an opportunity for you as an employer to ask the question in a skillful manner, because it tells you about the relationship, right? That, okay, well, why are you hesitating with this? Like Chris was saying, right? you know, what's your reservation about this lower cost? And if you're telling me that you can give me this lower value, right? I mean, we're a big buyer in this space, but we're not you know, there are other people who are bigger. So if they're unable to deliver that value to you, I guess you start to ask, well, are you really a prioritized customer in the way that they say you are, right? That the actions have to match the words.
And, you know, I'm an employer. I'm out to RFP right now, which means change won't happen till 2025, right? A lot of time between now and then. How quickly can you get this up and running so I can create a little bit of savings, not
Yeah.
just for the plan, right? But that's tremendous for the patient that's typically paying either 10 or 20% co-insurance on it, right? And some plans have a max limit on what they pay and some don't. Some, right, yes.
Yeah, what's nice about that third wedge, the direct-to-employer, is it takes us probably 2 to 3 weeks to load up the design. I mean, it's all pre-packaged, so this doesn't have that same mechanical obligation like you would incur in a full PBM change. We'll give you more value if you want to move your entire PBM offering, but we know that that can be complicated. It's a long process. There's other stakeholders in it. So to your point, you know, if you need help with an easy win, this is a good one, and Humira is just ripe right now. There are a number of other products that showed up in that report, which are also, you know, infrequently used, but, you know, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 of expense that we can reduce in a directional manner to something, you know, sub $100. So if you're looking, you know, again, for some surgical interventions, you know, we're here to help, and we have a data team that can help point out where to look if you want.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. Could you maybe speak to a little bit about how you informed your members and beneficiaries about the change? And the Humira example is excellent, from switching from a brand name to a generic, and kind of the internal public relations campaign you did to counter the evening news constant barrage of commercials telling you to ask your doctor about.
Yeah, I think like Dr. Kammerer, we partner internally, right? So there's good planned correspondence in advance of a significant change. We also are obligated to have done the homework to support the change, right? We're comfortable with our own family making this change. We're comfortable with our colleagues going through that change. We communicate both with the patient, we communicate with the prescriber, and we look for any situations where there's resistance. And then we typically are on a call with either one or both of them if there is a concern. So it's done in waves, kind of triaging those events. And I would say the 90+% of the time, the prescribers are fully on board with the engagements. It's just that direct-to-consumer experience, that advertisement that they saw, you know, on that YouTube clip, that's causing them to ask, not because they know what it is, they just heard something about it. And so when we settle on that clinical outcome, and we say, well, here's another product that wasn't highlighted in that commercial, you know, we get good endorsements.
Any other questions? Anything online? I'm looking for my, no, okay. I love easy wins.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, this is an easy win, which is wonderful. Thank you. We have one of our employer members who is going to join us on screen. Are we able to take the slide down and have Michelle on camera? Is that possible or no? Michelle says no. Michelle's like, I'm not prepared to be on camera.
I'm okay. I'm okay with being on camera.
Face, but I see your name, Michelle, which is.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can. I'll get going. And if there's any problem with my transmission, I've got the chat open. Wow. I just want to say, oh, and again, I'm Michelle Ritala with King County. I'm the benefit strategist there. Uh, I just want to say this was an amazing program. Thank you so much to the Alliance for having these tremendous, perfect panel of commentators, the solution providers, and of course, this groundbreaking study that was done by Three Axis Advisors and Antonio Chacha. You know, he may be a self-described data nerd, but I see him as a warrior for change. And honestly, he's one of my heroes right now. So you know, this study compares data sets from some self-insured employers in Washington State and compares it to actual reimbursements from pharmacy chains, retail chains, independent chains. And that's the kind of data that employers don't get to see. Maybe if you do a spread pricing on it, but even then, I don't think you're gonna see data to that extent. And it just lends evidence to what we've been seeing in our own data, our self-insured employers, our own data, what we've been hearing from independent pharmacists and pharmacy chains for years. And what we've been seeing in our communities is that these pharmacies cannot make it. They are going bankrupt and they're going out of business. And we all bear some responsibility for this. And we as employers don't want to see this happen. So what can we do? And some of what I say might be a little repetitive, but I learned from repetition, so I'm going to go for it. But recent legislation like the CAA, which gives employers more tools, requires higher levels of transparency from PBMs and also medical providers, which is a whole nother conversation, which the Alliance is going to be hosting, I think, a couple of weeks. But it gives employers more tools, but it also raises the bar for us to fulfill our fiduciary responsibility. And, you know, we're a government, we're not ERISA, but so what? Employers don't want to be cheated. We want to get the best deal that we can get. And we still have a fiduciary responsibility to our employees, whatever laws it is that you have to follow. We want to be part of the solution. So, and the other point I was going to make about the CAA is it raises the bar, the expectations for employers from not being just a prudent layperson, but a prudent expert. So if you don't have that kind of expertise on your benefit staff, if you don't have pharmacists on your staff, if you don't have doctors on your staff, you're going to need to hire it. I just have a quick story about Antonio Chacha, and it's not just because I like to say Antonio Chacha, but he gave a presentation through the Alliance. I think it was about a year and a half ago, and it was about a different study, which was also about spread pricing on generics. And it was comparing some data set of commercial insurance, self-insured employers to cost plus drugs, Mark Cuban's cost plus drugs, another hero of healthcare. And the poster child for one of the drugs he mentioned was imatinib, and that got us started. We took a look at what we were paying for imatinib and compared it to cost plus, and we saw that our experience was just like what he showed, which is we were paying about 100 times more than what an uninsured person would pay if they walked in off the street and got it at a local drugstore. So we do have our own data, and we asked our data warehouse vendor to do a comparison of all the drugs that Cost Plus sells that our members also purchase. And the results were not pretty. They were not, I can't get into too much detail because we're still right in the middle of all this, but they were very sobering. And so we did start asking some questions and talking to our PBM. And one of the things I learned was that that these higher prices for generics that we were paying were allowed under our contract. And that study was, as well as a few other things, is what enabled us to be able to make the case to our management that we needed to get independent pharmacy benefit consultant or advisor on board with us. In which, you know, at first glance might sound easy, but we had to make a case for that because the big three benefits consultants, they can be on your part of your team for years and years, and they provide a lot of really great services. But you really need an independent consultant who can help you look at all the data. They also have a lot of expertise in contracting. And you may learn that you may even want to get an attorney who has expertise in PBM contracting, because you need to have the pros on your team. And you will learn a lot. Believe me, you will learn a lot. You will want to get familiar with your own contract yourself, but again, you also need to have pros looking at that. We thought we had a great contract. Our contract says no spread pricing. We wound up learning that it was no spread pricing among participating pharmacies. And then when you looked at the definition of participating pharmacies, it didn't include the PBM owned pharmacies. So anyway, you know, there are just some gotchas in there that the average person is not going to pick up. And it was already talked about, you're going to want to evaluate your network options. If you have the PBM controls the specialty drug channel, controls the mail order channel, maybe you're even letting them control the retail channel, then they're also deciding what's on the formulary. That's a recipe for disaster. So if you're not sure if you're getting the best prices on drugs, you probably aren't. So, you know, I wanted to end on a positive note. So in order to do that, I want to say that you can do this. We're in the middle of doing it, and I'm oh, I had one comment about independent, getting an independent consultant. One thing we are doing is we require the consultant to sign an attestation that they receive no indirect payments from PBMs for placing business, or any indirect compensation. And also we want to know about any direct compensation that they get from PBM. So that's something I highly recommend. But you can do this, but you can't do it alone. So I would, and you may not know where to start. This is kind of overwhelming, but you have friends. I would say you talk to the Washington Health Alliance, look at the amazing program they put together. They can help you out. They can give you some referrals. Talk to other employers. I talk to a ton of employers. I'm happy to talk to any employer that might want to hear about what our experience is. And finally, I'd also say start now, because it takes a while. If you're in the middle of a contract and you want to get an RFP, again, the independent pharmacy consultant can do that for you, can run it for you. So, but these things take time. You might need to do an RFP for an independent consultant. So, get started, I guess, is all I can say. So thanks again to everyone on the panel, all the participants, and the Washington Health Alliance. Really enjoyed this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Really appreciate you closing out this program for us. And I thank everyone here in attendance, in person and online. Wonderful to be able to bring this program to you. And as Michelle said, just get out there, get started, take that first step.